So welcome to our Lab to Table event today. I am Dr. Erin Calipari. I am the Associate Director of the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research, and I'm Associate Professor in every department at Vanderbilt, but my primary department is the Department of Pharmacology. This event today is hosted by the School of Medicine Basic Sciences as a part of a monthly series of conversations connecting biomedical research to real-life topics. And so we're really excited to be with you all today to talk about something that I think we're all extremely passionate about. This event came from a series of conversations thinking about things that we thought that the public and us would be extremely excited about and had potential to actually have an impact on people's understanding of substance use disorder and the role that social media plays in this. We think it's particularly timely given the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on mental health, especially talking about substance use disorder and the trajectory and expression of this disorder in our society. What's really interesting too is as people were isolated, social media became kind of a space that we all relied on for social interaction. And I think it's important for us to have a conversation about how social media actually plays an important role in recovery and how we, as people that engage with social media, can actually think about how we discuss substance use disorder in a way that's helpful and actually can promote positive outcomes in individuals who are suffering from this. We'll be answering as many questions as we can as we go through this kind of moderated discussion. And so today, we're really excited to have with us leaders in the addiction and research and treatment fields. And I will actually let them introduce themselves. And so we can start, I guess, with Dr. Marcovitz.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Calipari, and so grateful for the opportunity to join this important event. Briefly, my name is Dave Marcovitz. I'm an addiction psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where I serve as the director for our Division of Addiction Psychiatry. So we're a group of about 20 faculty and staff, and we have clinical services across the recovery continuum here at Vanderbilt. And of course, we also have an education and research mission. I also serve as the principal investigator for a contract that the state funds for us to serve as the hub for opioid addiction treatment for Middle Tennessee. So very passionate about all things related to anti-stigma and also helping expand the reach of addiction treatment to those who are suffering. So grateful to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Maruti.
Thanks so much, Erin. Thanks for having us over. So I'm Sanchit Maruti. I'm the medical director of the University of Vermont Medical Center Addiction Treatment Center. I'm also the medical director of their Inpatient Psychiatry Service. It's a real pleasure to speak on this topic because it's a topic that impacts all of us and is very relevant. And working together with Dr. Marcovitz and Dr. Calipari, who does a lot of the basic science work related to this, I think we'll have a wonderful conversation and we look forward to it. So welcome.
Yeah, I'm excited, especially because I don't think there's many venues where you get people doing really basic science and people dealing with actual people in the clinic together to discuss kind of how we view all of this. Because it's always interesting to me. I feel like we have different perspectives, but in a lot of overlap. And so maybe to kind of start, you guys can talk a little bit about your perspective on how the pandemic has really affected a substance use disorder, maybe the number of people you're seeing, or kind of how it's affecting people. Like either one of you can take that one.
So this is a experience that we've all lived through the pandemic. And it has affected different people in different ways, just as life has affected people in different ways. There were some advantages in some of the changes that happened with the laws, that people were able to be seen by their providers on a remote access basis. Some of those rules are still being honored and extended. And that actually assisted with access to care. And that also allowed people who may not have had the means to get transportation, et cetera, to be able to get the care they needed. However, as Dr. Marcovitz and you, Dr. Calipari, have alluded to, that there was a lot of isolation during the pandemic. So things that we would not have thought of before, like having coffee with our friends virtually, et cetera, were things that we turned to. And the social media platforms really assisted in that and facilitated that, everything from the traditional sources like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, to Teams and Zoom. So there were initially, it was the best option that was available. As time has gone along, and now we are sort of 2 years from the beginning, 2.5, 3 years, and officially, the pandemic is drawing to an end according to WHO and just the way we're living our lives today. However, those primings of us using social media as a first go may remain. And so the way that we consume content, whether it's people that we know or people that we follow and aspire to, was much more facilitated. Our brains became much more primed to it. And that momentum in many ways has continued. So all of that has many positive components. However, one of the challenges is that evolutionarily, we were wired to meet each other in person. We were wired to see each other, make real eye contact, be in close physical proximity. And so what we're seeing is early sort of emergence of data that says that in some ways and in some people, there is a sense of isolation. And so the proverbial colloquial statement is, I may have 500 followers on LinkedIn or 10,000 on Twitter, but I feel very alone. I don't feel that it's somebody I can turn to at difficult times. And this is what we're seeing in the clinics. So the sort of ricochet effect is in some people, not all, and those are sort of questions that researchers will have to answer in the years ahead. In some people, there's a greater sense of isolation, a greater sense of hopelessness. And we are seeing that in certain measures like suicide rates. We're seeing that in deaths of despair, such as overdose deaths, et cetera. So it's not a blanket statement, but I think what we're really wanting to get a better handle on is who are the people who continue to use social media, not only responsibly, but actually more productively, and who are the people who are finding it more difficult to navigate this new post-COVID world.
It's funny you bring this up because for those of you who don't know me, my work is very basic. I don't deal with clinical populations, but what my lab studies is how things in the environment support reinforcement. So reinforcement is this to want to do something over and over again, the probability that you will do something more again in the future. And drugs are what we call very reinforcing substances because people take them, they feel good, they want to do it again, and they hijack these pathways in your brain that are involved in motivation and normal things that you should want to do again, like eating and having social interactions. Social media is really interesting because a lot of the principles that we know that influence how much you want to do something again, they use those to create, a website that people want to engage with. And so some things we know is that when things are presented to you and they're not predictable, they're kind of variable, people will engage more in these tasks. And so social media, the way they do it is they give you information, but you don't always know when the feed will refresh. And there's a lot of these things that really draw your attention in. And so, listening to this and how certain individuals may be susceptible to, being on social media, but it might cause more isolation. It kind of had these parallels with how some of these other kinds of things can influence our lives and maybe positive ways in some aspects, but negative ways in others, and how these could interact in the kind of ways I hadn't thought about before. So Dr. Marcovitz, what is your perspective on kind of how these things are interacting?
Yeah, it's such a big question, and I love Dr. Maruti's answer. I mean, I think the other piece with the pandemic was obviously the economic distress, which totally changed the landscape in terms of how people earn their livelihood and the stress related to that, I think, is worth mentioning in addition to the isolation. But I think it is really hard to draw universal trends. I mean, in the same way that we approach addiction treatment as one size fits one and on a very individual basis, I think for a person with a relatively healthy substrate, relatively strong bonds, social media could range from a little positive to a little negative. But I think for individuals who are really struggling, I personally am very, very skeptical of the contribution of that reinforcement that you were just alluding to, Dr. Calipari, because I think that there's so much vulnerability when individuals are dealing with anxiety and depression to getting sucked into unhealthy habits that I worry about that. But that's not based on the research. That's just kind of a personal observation.
Yeah, well, same. And I think as somebody who uses social media and has, siblings and nieces and nephews at various stages of development, how the information that's available to us affects us is actually something that's really interesting and important. And I see a lot of positives and negatives. But one thing, I think that is kind of interesting, and I get asked a lot from people, is how can I, as an individual not suffering from substance use disorder, be supportive and help, individuals with substance use disorder? And I do think that social media provides a really interesting platform for destigmatization. And so promoting, the use of, we were talking about this before, the use of appropriate language. Maybe you guys could both talk a little bit about how the language we use can influence individuals suffering from these disorders and how we can do this appropriately on social media in a way that actually helps people.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Dr. Calipari. I think that there is this shift toward person-centered language. I had shared a link in the chat, but I don't know if it needs to be shared again to be visible to the audience members. But the theme is person-centered language. And so we want to get away from labeling addict, abuser, especially things that are more pejorative like junkie, and move into the direction of a person with an addiction, a person with a substance use disorder. Terms like clean and dirty get thrown around a lot. We want to replace those terms with, various options, using, not using, sober, not sober. But we have to be mindful of this. And I think that as a side point, individuals with substance use disorders will often self-identify in the 12-step community as, I'm Dave and I'm an addict and that sort of thing. And we don't propose to dictate what people do in those community-based supports, but we want to be really cognizant that we in the treatment field don't label people without understanding first how they want to be called and what terms they want to use. And then the other piece I was going to say is just, did that link get shared, by the way?
I'm going to try to share it. If we can't share it, we will share it with the when we post this is recorded. It will be posted, and we can post that there. And I will tweet about it after this. So I will use social media to spread the word.
Yeah. Well, just one observation about the social media world, which I think is not very profound, but people they often talk to each other in a way that they wouldn't, right, if they weren't sitting in the room together. And I think that what we don't want to do is we don't want to shame people for using the wrong language, because who among us can keep up with the current language in so many different fields? And so my suggestion is that we use social media as a platform for educating people, but in a very non-threatening way. So
maybe I kind of have a question for maybe Dr. Maruti. You can talk about this a little bit. So I think one thing that in basic science we study a lot is not just how people take drugs. So addiction is a really interesting disorder because it's not just taking drugs. People take drugs all the time. They drink and they don't have a problem. But there's lots of things in individuals suffering from substance use disorder that can trigger relapse. So things like cues in the environment, things that they associated with the drug taking experience before. Do you have, have you thought at all, or I guess, what is your perspective on kind of how, when people come in, do they talk about these things? And are these triggers for some people things that they may interact with on social media? So pictures of people drinking, and how can that influence how people are able to be sober for long periods of time?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Calipari. That's a great question. We are living more and more of our lives virtually, and there is a fair bit of integration. And this is even before the widespread advent of augmented reality, virtual reality, which we anticipate will be more prevalent in our society in the next several years. The brain at this point oftentimes is not able to distinguish between images and between reality in some cases. So when you have people who are playing video games, they are so immersed, that's why it's called an immersive experience, where they actually feel danger, or they actually feel joy, etc. So to your point, we know that from sort of the past several decades of advertising, that when we would see a certain product, it would elicit certain feelings within us. This is just over television screens. We are seeing greater sophistication in that cue being presented virtually on the internet. And what happens, as you've alluded to, that the brain, sort of sees something differently, if you can think of the word sees in a different way, because the brain interacts with the world through the medium of neurotransmitters. And so when it sees certain cues, let's say in real life, it sees a billboard, or when I go to that gas station, right next to the packet of cigarettes, I see the cooler, which has the 6-pack. So suddenly I pair that stimulus. So I need to get gas for my car. While I'm in there, I'm picking up some milk, and it's in the cooler next to me. And so in the same way, when we are immersed in some type of social media presence, we may see certain cues, and we may immediately start thinking of something that may be associated with that. As researchers, I think researchers are seeing this much more in many of the lab experiments that they're doing, but I think we're seeing much more of that also in the clinical side. And it's something that I think we in the medical field should be mindful of, where we can give guidance, maybe even running a group on how to navigate virtual work, that you will see cues, and those cues can be both primers, not only from an addiction point of view, but possibly even in terms of re-evoking trauma, etc. So having that proactivity, both in the research side, but also on the clinical side, is very wise as we go deeper and deeper on the sort of social media side and the virtual side.
Well, yeah, and I think I spend a lot of time, just because I'm in the mental health space, of when I'm generating content online, I'm thinking about, can I do this in a way where I'm talking about substance use disorder, but I'm not putting pictures of things that could be triggering to individuals? And I think it's pretty simple once you're thinking about it, but if you're not in this space, I don't think it's something that you think about all of the time. And so, I like to, when people show up to these kinds of webinars, I think these are people who really care, that want to make a difference. And they're saying, what can I do to learn about this and help people? And I think a lot of this is thinking about how you interact with people online, the kinds of information you share, and the kinds of things that could affect other people, and how you can kind of change your language, change the things you post in a really simple way that doesn't really affect you that much, but would have a really large impact on other people. Another thing that I have, because thinking about social media too, and how, social media is a really interesting platform, because people who do marketing and people who kind of want to share information can do it to specific populations of people. And so, I'm thinking about kind of, vaping and all of these things for in the adolescent population. Is social media influencing people's perception of the safety of drugs too, or how safe they think they are, or how cool they think they are? And are there things that maybe we should be thinking about there, especially at different developmental time periods, of how that's something we should be kind of having a conversation about? Sorry, I know that's a tough one today, Dave. But
No, I mean, just shooting off the cuff. I mean, I think it's something Congress is talking about. And I think it's very important. I mean, I think that marketing to youth is not new. There's a playbook from the tobacco industry that goes back decades, and I think that it's a hard thing to regulate. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but for me, and this goes back to the prior question, I mean, I think it's all about the balance sheet, and that's to say protective factors and risk factors. And if we're just going after preventing the risk, then we're missing, I think, half the equation. And so I think it's of course, you know, we do what we can to police the targeting of youth, but I think the conversations with parents at home about what kids are seeing, the monitoring by parents, by teachers, the open dialogue about this is very important, because we need to shift the balance sheet in favor of our youth having more attractive things to do.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a couple of things in that space is when we're thinking about drug use at different periods of time, when you have people who are younger, who, you know, so your cortex takes a really long time to finish developing. And so it's not developing until you're well into adulthood. And so, you know, there's risks of taking drug during a developmental period that can change how your brain is being wired. And, you know, nicotine is a big one that's known to do that. And then the kind of interesting thing I think about nicotine itself relative to other drugs is nicotine as a drug is not a really, really reinforcing substance, but what it does is it interacts with other things in the environment to make you learn about them very intensely. And so the thing about these vape products is they have flavorants in them and things that serve as cues to people. And these actually are very important to how they're working. And I think for a long time, those vapes had flavors that were marketed to younger individuals. You know, you don't have people who are in their 70s smoking bubblegum flavored vapes. And so I think that has been a big conversation. But I guess one thing too is with this access and with people knowing about these things, do you think, how do you guys deal with people who are smoking at an earlier age, vaping at an earlier age, and how is that affecting developmental trajectories? And I guess I think parents we're getting a lot of questions about those kinds of things. Do you have thoughts in that space?
Yeah, it's a very, very present and relevant series of questions, especially for parents. Again, it's a fairly new phenomenon. Large studies that can conclude certain things are still underway. In general, in the rough cuts, what we have seen is for people who are established as, say, smokers, there is some value to using this as a bridge for them to stop smoking, stop that behavior. The way it's marketed is that it's less pernicious than all the compounds that are in the actual old-fashioned cigarettes. However, on the counter side, we're seeing that for younger people, precisely for the reasons you mentioned, that it feels less injurious, it feels less dangerous, it feels more acceptable. And especially when you add those type of flavors, it seems almost like the cue is from, you know, as I go get a candy, a stick of gum, this is sort of in that realm of it's okay. And that's where the concern really lies. What social media does is that it's an accelerant in a way, because although let's say our parents' generation, they may be using Facebook as a way of being in touch with their grandchildren, etc. Then you have a younger generation which sort of identifies much more with, say, Instagram, and that's their means of their community, ways of being cool. And then we're seeing in the younger generations, it goes towards TikTok as a preferred modality. So when these things like vaping is paired with that, it becomes a catalyst to say, oh, well, all my friends are, you know, showing their different flavors, and maybe I should be doing the same thing. So exercising vigilance, as Dr. Marcovitz said, that we don't have regulation at this point, either in the sense for vaping in a clear way or social media. Certain countries are sort of limiting the time that children can play video games or can be on things like TikTok. But for parents, as Dr. Marcovitz said, that one way to say it is that, hey, don't do this, which is never something that works very well with adolescents, etc. But another is to give them alternatives, as your work has indicated, Dr. Calipari, that the brain really craves that dopamine. It craves that sort of, mix of neurotransmitters. And so finding other avenues for younger people to receive it, whether it's through sports, whether it's through other forms of community and community participation, that could be a counterweight.
Yeah, I think about these kinds of things a lot too. You kind of brought up this idea, of social media, and they're not going to listen to an adult saying, hey, that's bad. But I think that this next generation coming up, they love information. The problem is it's getting harder and harder and harder to figure out what information is evidence-based and what isn't. But actually in the Addiction Center at Vanderbilt, we have been working with students. So Danny Winder is the director of the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research, and what he has been doing through this Vanderbilt program is teaching high school students about addiction. And what they do is they learn about addiction, and then they create content themselves. We go over it with them to make sure it's accurate, and they go into local middle schools around Nashville to present to the peers. This is what addiction is. Here's the information. This is the developing brain. And I think having, TikTok creates this platform where students can talk to each other. And so maybe us as educators and clinicians, we are spread very thin, but, thinking about how social media can be used to actually get information to youth in the language that they receive information is, I think it could be a powerful tool. The problem right now is it's populated by not us and not that kind of information.
That's right. And I shared a link with the panelists that, Dr. Calipari can decide if this makes sense to share with the audience. But I think that, I'll brag on you a little bit. That Dr. Calipari came and spoke to our clinical group and has an amazing way of translating basic science to a general audience. And I think that this is really what's needed. I agree with you completely that I have a balloon that is coming, went into a fan and was about to cause destruction here. Anyway, I do think that young people are interested in accurate information and education, especially when it's translated for them, but with the original citations intact. And so the link that I shared was about the updates on the gateway hypothesis from a basic science perspective, and really is addressing the question we were just talking about and suggesting that vaping is a huge public health concern from the standpoint of priming youth to be more at risk for progression to illicit drug use, which I'm very concerned about. I think all of our panelists are very concerned about the fentanyl, the synthetic fentanyls that have gotten into the supply of just about everything. And so I think that we have to be mindful of the neuroscience that you brought it back to, Dr. Calipari. And I think if we can translate that information on social media, I think that's a big win, because the youth are skeptical and we can leverage that. We want them to be skeptical.
Well, and I think another thing, thinking about this too, and I've talked to a lot of people around Vanderbilt about this, is you bring up fentanyl, and we're starting to see all kinds of drugs. So people go and they think they're taking one drug and they're actually taking another. And I think one thing that social media has been great for is sharing information about how drugs work. And so you have opiates, they act on mu receptors, and there are drugs that we can give that block that. They're called antagonists. And so Narcan is one of those. And I think you start to get a public that's more educated about how drugs work. And if they're more educated about how drugs work, they become educated about how they can help people suffering from overdoses. And so you start to have this kind of platform where you say, hey, maybe we should be having access to Narcan around college campuses. Yes, we want to prevent drug use. That's obviously all of our goal. But how do we also save individuals if they have taken drug? And I think a lot of that is by providing young people with accurate information that they have access to that helps them kind of figure out how to navigate that process. Because saying, hey, this is bad. Well, what does bad mean? Lots of things are bad. Like, what do you mean by that? And giving them that information. I think social media is a great platform for that, but it's it takes time, it's hard, and I think we should probably be thinking about how we communicate to the youth and who should be doing it and how, and maybe it's themselves and us teaching our grad students how to do these things. Along a similar line, do you all think that are the patients that you're dealing with, are they coming in more educated because they have easy access to information about what treatments are available and they're able to research this? And do you think that some of this kind of information access has actually leveled the playing field for people, or is it made your job more difficult? What do you think about that?
Yeah, great question. What we find is that having an engagement with patients, an opportunity to discuss what they saw, actually is very beneficial. So if they have seen something that is from a credible site, that's wonderful, and it allows us to affirm that message. And if they have read something or on Reddit or those type of things, it allows us to engage with them of what did you find important here? This is what we know. And for many people, it's very, very helpful. I think it also highlights the importance of centers like the Vanderbilt Center on Addiction or the Vermont Center for Rural Addiction, CORA. It really highlights the importance for the credible places where good research is being done with a lot of human subjects protection, doing it in an ethical way with IRB approvals, that they also put that presence out there so that we as physicians can point our patients towards those sites and say, hey, you may see a lot of sort of information presented in different places. We can't vouch for that, but here are 4 or 5 of the leading ones that present information in a very understandable and digestible way. So there are a lot of really good opportunities in that regard.
I could add one comment to that, Dr. Calipari, if there's time, which is just that whether it's patients in our office or friends of our audience members, and some of you may be in a position to be coaches or authority figures, is I never want to miss an opportunity to mention motivational interviewing, which is simply a way of interacting with patients, with people, that is based on principles of empathy and compassion. And I think that when our patients bring us information that they have kind of latched onto for one reason or another, it's really important that we first kind of reflect back what we've heard. And as I've heard Dr. Maruti say so many times, kind of figure out where we want to be on the tennis court before we take a swing, because we might not realize how tightly held a patient's belief is about something they've read. And so by first kind of reflecting and summarizing and making sure we understand what they've read, what it's meant to them, why it's important to them, they're more likely to be interested in what we think about that content. And so I just think it's important to mention, with so much disinformation out there, I've had my share of conversations about that they don't care what we know until they know that we care. So
I think that's such an important thing as people who have been in education of some sort for many years, right? You're taught through graduate school and an undergraduate, how do we identify information? How do you evaluate this? How to have a critical eye? But that doesn't make you smart. Like, my parents are not super educated, but they're some of the smartest critical thinkers that I know. They can solve problems with information they've never encountered before if it's given to them. And I think for us going into these conversations with, by the way, youth are the same way. These are smart people who just don't have as much experience or information, and going in and not saying, well, that's stupid, but saying, wow, how do we help give these intelligent individuals the information they need to make critical thoughts, and how do we give them information in ways that they can accept it to help them, is really important. Like I always say with science, like, my job isn't to just tell you I'm smart. Like, if I want to talk about my work, there's so many ways I can do it where no one but me would understand what I'm saying. That's not the point of communication. It's for me to make the people I'm talking to understand why what I'm doing is important. And I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in translation with conversations on social media as well, where there's a lot of, well, this is dumb. okay, well, that's not helpful. How do we communicate with people in a way that we get that information out
That's
there?
right. That's right. And it is neuroscience based because so much of how we interpret information is, there's stuff happening unconsciously. The limbic system is playing a role in how we feel about the source of the information. And so I think that we use a lot of affirmation. It's good that you're asking this.
Yes.
And when we start from that standpoint, we get more benefit.
So
Yeah,
what
and I'll just add that what social media provides is a sense of community. And community is something that's very salient in our human experience that we all desire and crave and gravitate towards. And so the opportunity for teenagers, adolescents, young adults, treat teenagers to have a safe space where they can receive what they would like in a healthy, community-oriented way can be a real resource also. So they have other places that they can turn to where they can be experiencing a sense of belonging and a sense of respect and safety.
So this is perfect because I just highlighted a question that I was going to ask you guys next anyway, and then you transitioned into it. So it makes me seem like this amazing moderator. So what you're talking about is community. Do you think that social media, like the presence of social media, has actually helped reduce stigma in a way? And has that helped recovery? Or do you think it's kind of depends on the community and where people are? I guess, how do you think that the fact that people now have a community where people can talk about this helps or hurts recovery process?
Well, I'll take the first stab at it. I mean, I'm probably missing a huge blind spot here, but I really think it's net positive, which is rare me saying something positive about social media. But all of the talk about vulnerability, which has permeated the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, Brene Brown and her stuff. I also think the Me Too movement itself. I mean, where we started to expose the shadows and encourage people who were having the courage to speak out about things that were very vulnerable and very private previously. I think this all shifts us in a direction to an embracing of talking about mental illness, which hopefully then translates into getting reliable information. That's the part that's not as obvious. But I think it's net positive.
I've seen this really large shift, I feel like, in society since I've been studying this, where, I do a lot of public speaking, and I would go to places and people would tell me, well, people just need to be tougher. And in the last 10 years, I think some of this came on with the opioid epidemic, and some of this came on with the fact that COVID increased drug use, and people, I think, started to have it affecting them and people very close to them. Now, I think people are a little more open to thinking about addiction as a disease, like we think about other mental health conditions. And I think the big thing that came with that is, we're in Nashville, that's where we're located. And there's a lot of people in the country music industry here, and a lot of them have suffered from substance use disorder. And it's been so kind of inspiring to see these people in recovery come out and say, hey, you see me, I'm performing at a top level, but I suffered from this for a really long time. Let me tell you how it affected my life. And I think having people online that are willing to say, I am recovering from substance use disorder, has really helped people say, well, okay, well, they are suffering from this. Then the fact that I'm suffering from this isn't some sort of huge moral failing. And I think that conversation and the fact that we have access to people's stories and people are willing to share them has really helped people feel comfortable identifying as somebody who suffers from substance use disorder, as opposed to saying, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. This is just how it is. And I think that that's really maybe allowed some people to get help. And so I think these conversations where we're saying, hey, look, like, this is a disorder, you can get help for it. You can be supported. Here are the treatment options, I think, is a really powerful thing that helps people navigate that.
There are some risks, I think, as I'm listening to you, Dr. Calipari. I mean, I do think there are some risks that are worth noting. I mean, certainly people identifying with a story that they see can be positive, but then they may assume that, what worked for that individual, which might have been you know, it could have been any number of things, but it might sort of narrow their field of what's possible. I think also they may not actually get the support that they may sort of think that the online support they're getting is a substitute for getting you know, something that's more thorough or more professional or in person. And then finally, I think there is a risk of oversharing that this generation, you know, how many times do we sit and look at what's being posted and we sort of say, ooh, you know, does the person really realize the downstream effects of sharing something so private? And so I think that for people to have supports that they can bounce that kind of thing off of before they go public with is important.
Do you all think that that this kind of, so I've also noticed this, you know, I kind of admire the younger generation for just sharing their, this is who I am, deal with it. But the fact that that can lead to criticism and things like that, which can affect other mental health conditions, anxiety, stress disorders. Do you both, in the patients that you deal with on a regular basis, do you see a lot of comorbidities, and is a lot of, you know, drug use kind of tied to emotional distress, stress disorders, depression, or are they kind of standalone issues?
Yeah, you know, we see both. We see both, and it really depends on the individuals. We know that when you look at the sort of the Venn diagrams, you know, there's a large number of Americans that grapple with mental health conditions. Then there are millions who grapple with substance use disorders, and then there's that subset that overlaps with both. And we call it co-occurring conditions. And for practitioners in the field, it's very wise to at least have a sense of, are we seeing something that needs additional attention? It has evolved where it used to be at one time that you treated one, and once the addiction was in better control, you treated their depression, etc. And now the thinking is that you do it in a very parallel way. So it just depends on different patients, as Dr. Marcovitz said at the beginning, that you know, you can't have a one size fits all. One size often fits one.
Yeah. Just want to go back, and this may not be related, so follow my unconscious on this one. But I think that, you know, going back to the risks of the kind of oversharing on social media, and I think to your most recent question, Dr. Calipari, of course, if there's existing vulnerability to anxiety or depression, then that echo chamber can exacerbate it, and then could indirectly lead to an exacerbation of substance use. But I think sometimes when we lament sort of, oh, Gen Z is doing this or that, I think part of it is that when social media becomes a form of avoidance from learning the tough skills of having dialogue with our professor, with our boss, with our colleague. And so, you know, if I'm going to go post about how, you know, my boss or my professor is so insensitive, and nobody understands about mental illness, you know, there may be a place for that, but do I then deny myself the opportunity to get some coaching on how to talk about that in the workplace or in my place of education with the people who could stand to benefit from hearing my perspective in a more direct way? And so I think that sometimes the complaining about the use of social media is sort of like we're missing out on some dialogue, I think.
I was looking, I teach a lot of different things, and I was teaching a class the other day on using social media for science communication.
Mm-hmm.
And I was actually looking up statistics, because I think one thing that's really easy for people to think, and this is true on Facebook, it's true on Twitter, on TikTok, is that they see a lot of information and they assume that that is what everybody thinks, because they say, oh, I saw 100 tweets and everyone's on the same page. And actually, if you look up on social media, the number of people that are on Twitter, it's actually a relatively small percentage of the population. And even of the people on Twitter, an even smaller percentage of that is generating 90% of the tweets. It's like it's like 5% of the users generate 90% of the tweets. So you're literally looking at this kind of cross section, and you get this false sense that that's what everyone thinks. And I think that that's just something to keep in mind is especially if you're somebody who's susceptible to stress and saying, oh, well, I'm not part of the group because everyone thinks this and I don't think that, is that that's maybe not always the reality. So it creates this community, but the community is a very specific community that's a small section of society. And I think that that's the hard thing, right? Is that social media, and this kind of goes back to where we started, is it provides a really powerful tool for people who are in rural communities during COVID to reach out and communicate with people. But it also, in a weird way, creates isolation because it gives you a false sense of exactly how people are interacting and what's appropriate and what isn't. And I think that those things are just things to have these conversations about. But I mean, I'm on it. I completely understand. Sometimes I come to work and say, oh my gosh, everyone thinks this. And then I'll talk to 20 people at Vanderbilt and they're like, nobody thinks that. And I'm like, oh, wait. And it is just this kind of interesting space that I think can lead to stress, especially in young people who haven't had the kind of world experience, maybe. Although I do love the youth. I feel like they're just like, they're a new energetic group that like wants change. And I really like the transparency in a lot of ways. It's just, you have to think about kind of the whole picture. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question we just got.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No. Well, I was just going to say that in a nutshell, that influencing on social media may be a very different skill set than influencing in person. And I think that learning both skill sets is probably important.
This is so funny. It's like you guys like are reading my mind. That we've got several questions about how influencers themselves, these people who are amazing at engaging large populations of people online, could potentially play a role in kind of destigmatization and kind of thinking about how, you know, that those kinds of things fit into that question. I think I'll kind of word this in maybe a more specific way. Do you think that there's ways where people can think about like habits and what are healthy and unhealthy habits, and having a conversation around those kinds of things, and how you, I guess, like reducing drug use, is that the only goal? Or should we be having a conversation, a bigger conversation around how we help people make different decisions, and maybe how social media could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. Influencers have certainly been influencers, and they're occupying a larger and larger role in adopting certain product use or fashion trends or habits. At the end of the day, you know, the brain learns. And if the brain can again experience that there are alternatives to whether it's influencers or short-term bursts of dopamine from, say, the Instagram or the swiping, then the brain will gravitate towards that. What we don't know right now is who are the people who enjoy sort of that deeper dive, a walk, reading a book, spending time with friends, versus for whom a substitute, whether the other alternative is not available, but is to sort of stay within the social media realm. But the brain is a learning organ, and as your work has shown, Dr. Calipari, so what we can do as both researchers, clinicians, parents, educators, is to have our children and our young adults have alternatives. They can be through the channel of social media. Hey, there's a meetup group for a run or kayaking. Hey, you know,
or an ice plunge.
Or an ice plunge. Or there's a giveaway of this, you know, healthy juice company. So you can use the same marketing sort of approaches of co-branding, etc., where the draw is equally exciting in a different way, and you meet positive people and you're able to engage in sort of positive and healthy activities. So this is for this generation of public health promoters to also think about how we can integrate influencers in a case like this, you know, people who are cool but also in recovery, or people who are cool and young whose parents may be in recovery, who say, hey, you know, we have learned the firsthand effects of it, and here are some alternatives. Come join us. So it can also be a really powerful tool to encourage salubrious behavior.
Yeah.
Could I add one thing, Dr. Calipari?
Yeah.
When Dr. Maruti says the brain learns, it just takes my brain in all these directions because I really am wary, and I think that it's sort of a metaphysical question of whether social media can be used to decrease social media use in ways that foster healthy habits. And it's not a sentient being in and of itself, but it has kind of hijacked the brains of a lot of sentient beings. And I think that what I worry about is whether, and again, I thought we were going to be, talking a little bit about this. I'm wondering if our audience is comprised of some people who may be struggling with, if not a use disorder or a process addiction, but at least kind of these fundamental questions of, am I on social media too much? And is it affecting my life? Is it affecting my enjoyment of my life? And I think the hard thing is that unless you take a pause from it, it's really hard, right? Because like Dr. Moody said, the brain learns, and the brain is learning every time folks are using it, but then it becomes harder and harder to take a step back. And so I'm at risk of getting on my soapbox. I'm a proponent of 30-day periods of abstinence, as we use the term in the addiction field. But doing something really differently takes an initial commitment, just as sort of a curious experiment for people, I think, to ask themselves what would happen. And I think that from there, I think there is an opportunity to then get back onto something in a healthier way, and to sort of say, okay, now I know that these are the parameters I need to put around my social media use. This is how I can use it for good in terms of influencing others to try what I tried, try a 30-day break.
I love this though, because what I don't think people realize is that, again, the way the social media is set up to hijack pathways involved in reinforcement. It is specifically designed, the way it refreshes, the way that you have to refresh it, the way that you're engaging with it, the way that things are being pushed to you are specifically designed to keep your attention for periods of time where you kind of get lost in it, and where it becomes a habit. And so what's really interesting, sometimes you feel yourself picking up your phone and then you open TikTok and you're like, wait a minute, I wasn't even going on here to use TikTok, but for some reason I just opened it. All of those things are designed that way. And I think just sometimes being educated makes you reflect on, what is my behavior being driven by? Was that a conscious decision, or is that something I'm just in a loop from? How do I kind of disengage? And again, it's not quite the same as drugs. I think a lot of times as people who work in the addiction space, you get a lot of questions where you're like, I'm addicted to all kinds of things that aren't really addiction, but they still create problematic patterns of behavior that are harmful in other ways, because they detract from social interaction. And when you start thinking about this, okay, when you start isolating yourself, that's a risk factor for a lot of other mental health disorders. And so there's lots of things that are intertwined here. And I think it is, again, it's a powerful tool, but it also has some other things that maybe aren't so positive, and thinking about how to utilize it in a way that balances those things out so that you're getting a lot from it, but not having it take it away from your life. So there's actually a question in the chat. We only have like 5 minutes left. And this is a good one. And I think what this person is asking is, how do you get across your audience on social media that you have experience and background to debunk some of the myths they learned from influencers? And this kind of goes back to what you both were talking about when you interact with your patients. How do you do this in a way that makes people want to listen to what you're saying, opposed to the fun TikTok dance that says, hey, this product is awesome? How do you compete with that?
Yeah, one of the things that Dr. Marcovitz mentioned was motivational interviewing, or another term is motivational enhancement techniques. And one of the tenets of that is you meet people where they're at. So once you can have that engagement, because they may have some answers, they may have some ambivalence. Another approach that often helps is an approach called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, where you try to understand what are their values, and is what they're doing helping them towards where they want to go, or is it taking them away? as Dr. Marcovitz had said, and as a lot of the work that you've done, Dr. Calipari, highlights is, sometimes the being avoids things because its amygdala is stimulated, it's afraid. And so it is going away from that fear stimulus. So by meeting people where they're at, by establishing a good connection, what we call is a therapeutic alliance, working with their ambivalence to see where they would like to go and where they would like to dedicate their resources. That could be a start for a long and hopefully productive type of engagement.
Yeah, and actually this kind of gets to another question that just got asked, where somebody says, I really want to use social media to more to help others. Do we have tips? And I think this builds on kind of what you're saying, is thinking about what your audience, who is your audience? In a clinical practice, you have a patient, that's your audience. It can't be everybody. It can't be everybody. For me, there's lots of people who still don't accept that addiction is a brain disorder. And so that's maybe some of those people I can change their mind, but who is my audience? And my audience as a scientist are educated, maybe not even highly college educated, but intelligent people who want information, that are interested in these problems. And I distill it in those spaces. But I think, how do you help people? I think some of it is thinking about, we said this, language, talking, how do you talk about these problems using language that doesn't stigmatize people, avoiding tweeting things that are cues, imagery, things that could have negatively affect people that you care about in that space, and not being afraid to kind of speak up about those kinds of issues. And I think, again, all the stuff that you guys said about how you think about how you're communicating with people and how you're listening, and that it's a two-way conversation, listening to people, how they feel about it, and how to do that in a way that's calm and don't get pulled into internet trolls, because some people just want to be mad.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Do you guys have any last thoughts that you feel passionate about, that you think people should know, how to best help people in this community?
Yeah, one of the first things I can say is mindfulness. Not simply mindfulness in a sense of meditation, although that's very helpful, but just being aware, smart choices. That if, for example, one finds that I'm reading the newspaper for half hour a day, that's okay, because that's important to me to get my information. But there are many times that people might be on social media for a long time and they don't realize, oh my goodness, 2 hours went away. So having just an ability to have that check-in with one's own self to say, is this something that I want? Or how would I like to change it? And what would I like to do instead of it? Questions were asked about how to do this credibly. And what we would really say is that there are a number of credible agencies, including centers like the Vanderbilt Center or the University of Vermont Center, where a lot of us, if we post things or if we put things, they are vetted as best as they can through evidence, but also the National Institute of Drug Addiction, American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, etc. So reaching out to those organizations and even just attaching links and maybe following those organizations, because typically material that emerges from that is evidence-based, and then maybe retweeting it or putting it in a format that is connected to that could be one place to start.
Dave, any last thoughts?
Just quickly, yeah, not suggesting renunciation of social media, but I do think for those who are concerned about any kind of process addiction related to it, that I'm reasonably confident that the tools we apply in talk therapy, like acceptance and commitment therapy and CBT, can be helpful to individuals. So don't be shy, even if it's a newer set of evidence. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Calipari and Dr. Maruti and Erin Conley and the others. This has been a really fun session.
Same. Thank you all also.
Yeah, thank you. And so thank you all, panelists and attendees, for joining us for this lab to table conversation about social media and addiction. We're going to follow up with a link to the recording of this event that you'll be able to watch again and share. And we hope that you'll join us in the future for this monthly series that spans topics that are not only things I'm passionate about, but things that other faculty around the basic sciences are passionate as well. And so we appreciate your attendance today, and have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.